On the 10th of February 1943, at 6:45 in the morning, more than 1,000 Soviet cannons opened fire simultaneously from Kolpino, 20 kilometers from Leningrad. For almost 2 hours, 36,000 projectiles fell upon a sector of trenches defended by 4,500 men. Those men were not Germans. They wore the same Wehrmacht uniform, used the same Mauser rifle, slept in the same type of trench dug into frozen earth at 20 degrees below zero, but they spoke Spanish. And when the Soviet armored vehicles began to advance through the smoke and craters, something occurred that the Red Army General Staff had not calculated. The Spaniards did not flee. What happened that Wednesday in Krasny Bor was the culmination of 2 years of a story that no one in Europe could have invented. 47,000 Spanish volunteers, phalangists, adventurers, workers, university students, legionnaires from Africa, day laborers from Huelva and Badajoz marched to the other end of the continent to fight in the most brutal war of the 20th century. Many went convinced that the fate of Western civilization was being decided in those frozen plains. Others simply needed the money. A few hoped to desert to the enemy. Almost none knew what truly awaited them. This is the story of the Blue Division, how it was formed, why it surprised friends and foes alike, and what it left behind. On the night of June 21st, 1941, the Spanish Foreign Minister Ramón Serrano Suñer was dining with 2 Falangist leaders in Madrid. He knew what the world did not yet know. That same night, while the 3 men spoke in the dim light of a dining room in the capital, 137 German and Allied divisions awaited the order to cross the Soviet border along 2,000 kilometers of front. The plan was already drawn. What Serrano Suñer wanted, before dawn broke, was to have his own response ready. At 6 o'clock in the morning on June 22, 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa mobilized 3,300,000 soldiers, 3,325 battle tanks and 600,000 horses. In Madrid, the news arrived by radio, and with it, something that no one in the Franco regime had fully coordinated: the enthusiasm of the street. The Phalange acted with a speed that surprised even its own leaders. On June 24th, a demonstration organized in great haste wound through the streets of Madrid to the party headquarters. There, from an improvised balcony, Serrano Suñer pronounced what became the war cry for everything that followed: Russia is guilty. Guilty of the death of José Antonio Primo de Rivera, executed in the Alicante prison in November 1936, guilty of having supported the Republic, guilty, according to the rhetoric that had been building for years in the Falangist printing presses, of everything that had bloodied Spain. The crowd cheered. Some continued to the British embassy and broke windows. Then they moved to the German representation to declare their support. That same day and the next, similar scenes were repeated in Seville, Malaga, Alicante. In Asturias, the monthly report of the local Phalange described that the Oviedo station had overflowed with people cheering the first volunteers who were departing. 140 men, delirium on the platform. The Council of Ministers met on June 23rd and 24th and approved the creation of a Spanish division of volunteers to be integrated into the Wehrmacht. General Agustín Muñoz Grandes was designated to command it. He had led the assault guard during the Second Republic, had served as Secretary General of the Phalange, and had sufficient political credibility to satisfy the military without overly irritating the blue shirts. Serrano Suñer did not particularly like him, but he accepted him. The division was officially called the Spanish Division of Volunteers. The popular name arose from the uniforms of the Falangist militias, the blue shirts, and from an idea attributed to the party's Secretary-General José Luis de Arrese. Dionisio Ridruejo, poet, Phalangist, one of the architects of the project, found the name somewhat ridiculous. But he predicted it would be successful. He was right about the second part. The recruitment process began on June 25th. Instructions arrived that night to all provincial chiefs of the Phalange. Volunteers had to be between 20 and 28 years old, pass a medical exam, preferably with military experience. 75% had to be former combatants of the Civil War or former prisoners of the Republican side. The deadline for the military was 48 hours. The civilian phalangists had until July 2nd. What happened in the following days was a phenomenon that the regime had desired but did not fully control. In Madrid, the Phalange reported thousands of people flowing toward the recruitment centers. In Murcia, more than 2,000 members or sympathizers presented themselves at the offices. In Albacete, 984 people went to sign up. 329 of them, including 5 local leaders, departed for Russia weeks later. But the image of unanimous enthusiasm was partial. In Catalonia, the pressure on military commanders to cover quotas was intense, and the German consul in Barcelona pointed out that the number of soldiers enrolled had jumped from a few to several hundred in days, which led him to seriously question the level of real volunteering. In Navarre, the Carlists, dominant in the local structure of the Phalange, followed the instructions of their leader in exile, Manuel Falconde, who had ordered them to abstain. In Alava, the number of Requetes who presented themselves was practically zero. And then there were those who went for other reasons. The temporary soldier Joaquin Montana, from the region of El Bierzo, recalled decades later why he signed up. 7 pesetas a day. With that money you could eat at the hotel and have enough left over to treat your friends. I didn't know much about the Phalange or communism. We dreamed of the uniform. One day, when we returned, we would be heroes. Antonio Gomez, a day laborer from Huelva, was more succinct. I signed up mainly because in the village they looked at me as if I were a bandit, since my ideology was more left-wing. And besides, the economic situation of my family was terrible. The division was exactly that, an amalgam. Phalangists by conviction, officials seeking promotions, university students from the SEU who had never fired a weapon, legionnaires from Ceuta and Melilla who were practically mercenaries, illiterate workers from Badajoz and Huelva who had signed without fully understanding what they were signing, and more than one with a left-wing political background who hoped to cross over to the enemy as soon as they had the chance. In July 1941, around 18,000 men took shape as the 250th Infantry Division of the Wehrmacht, the Spanish Freiwilligen Division. 3 infantry regiments, the 262nd, the 263rd, and the 269th, plus artillery, engineers, signals, anti-tank, military police. On July 31st, at the Kremerberg camp, under the German and Spanish flags, the division swore loyalty to the head of the German army, Adolf Hitler, in the struggle against communism. The text of the oath had been modified to avoid the word Führer. It was a distinction that mattered little to most of those recruited. The first trains with Spanish volunteers crossed Hendaye on July 13th. The first thing they experienced upon arriving in France was hostility. French railway workers and civilians who saw the convoys pass by hurled insults and obscene gestures, some threw stones. Minor altercations were frequent every time the trains stopped. Those scenes would be repeated for 2 years. The atmosphere changed upon entering the territory of the Reich. In Karlsruhe, the welcome was warm. German civilians cheered their exotic allies, some even exchanging addresses and photographs with the soldiers through the train windows. The contrast did not go unnoticed by any divisionary. The trains arrived at the Grafenwohr training camp in the Upper Palatinate between July 17th and 23rd. What they found there impressed almost everyone. Modern facilities, clean barracks, organization that seemed from another planet compared to the barracks they had left behind in Spain. Dionisio Ridruejo, dazzled, wrote from the camp itself that they were in the middle of a colossal army, almost painfully perfect, an army that is like the people it serves. Artillery Colonel Jesus Badillo agreed at first. The Germans were, as a collective, a great people. Months later he would qualify that enthusiasm when he discovered that those commanders who seemed like demigods also committed tactical errors and limited themselves, in his words, to obeying orders like robots, unable to improvise when something went wrong. The contrast between German military efficiency and Spanish disorder became evident almost immediately in two very specific areas: health and supply. Until well into 1942, the divisionaries were clear that their German comrades ate better and were better equipped, although, in theory, both armies received a similar diet. The difference was noted even more in the hospitals. The convalescing Spaniards pointed out time and again the contrast between the cleanliness and organization of the German medical centers, with sympathetic staff, and the precariousness of the Spanish ones, even in the German rear where both coexisted. But Grafenwohr was also the first real clash with what they had gotten into. The training period lasted 5 weeks, 1/3 of the normal Wehrmacht training, which was 12 weeks. Very little time, barely half of what Germany considered indispensable to form a soldier. The soldiers had to learn to handle the Karabiner 98K rifle, the MG-34 machine guns, the mortars, the anti-tank guns. They had to adapt to the German military rhythm: réveillé at 5:30 in the morning, cold dinner at the end of the afternoon, early curfew. For many, it was harder to adapt to the new diet than to the physical training with live ammunition required by the German motto, "Sweat saves blood." Complaints about the food filled the letters of the first days: boiled rye, blonde tobacco, beer instead of wine, mealtimes. Everything was strange. Dionisio Ridruejo, the Phalangist poet who had helped design the project, complained of the extravagant, although not always complete, meals. Others complained about the discipline, the harshness of the German instructors, the cultural abyss between the Spanish way and the German way of understanding military order. Added to this was the lack of mail from Spain, and what one officer described as the disciplinary and ruthless treatment from German sergeants and officers. Some Phalangists, who had been reduced to the status of simple private soldiers, went as far as formally complaining to the Spanish embassy in Berlin. Even more uncomfortable than that treatment was, for the most ideological, the scarce political solidarity they found. Despite the recommendations of the German diplomat Eberhard von Storer himself, the Phalangist leaders of the division barely had contact with delegations from the NSDAP, except for a protocol visit on August 17 by Robert Ley, director of the German Labour Front. Lieutenant Colonel Luis Aguilar noted in his diary that the barracks had fewer mattresses than soldiers and that the food was bad and dirty. In the first weeks, 400 men had contracted venereal diseases before departing or during the trip, often through contact with women on the trains themselves. 285 were repatriated on August 4 after receiving treatment, along with 62 considered unfit for service and a sergeant of African origin. It was beginning to be seen what would be a constant. The division was anything but homogeneous. Even so, the Germans observed with something that was not exactly admiration but not contempt either, a mixture of fascination and alarm. The bilingual instructors assigned to the Spaniards reported a genuine will to fight. The Garipas, a nickname the divisionaries themselves used to refer to each other, were individually brave. The problem was everything else. The weapons arrived poorly cared for. The horses, 5,610 animals, requisitioned in the Balkans and already in a lamentable state, received treatment that scandalized the German veterinarians. The problem was aggravated because in Spain a disproportionate number of drivers had been recruited under the idea that the division would be motorized. When the moment of truth arrived, they had to be converted in great haste into horse caretakers, a craft that almost none mastered. Too many officers in proportion to non-commissioned officers, and no motorized vehicles of their own. Spain had been unable or unwilling to provide the 300 trucks and 400 motorcycles originally promised. The relationship with the Bavarian civilian population revealed another side of that German machine, that of social control. At first, the treatment was of friendly curiosity. The divisionaries would later recall dozens of pleasant anecdotes about their neighbors in Grafenwohr and Auerbach. But internal reports from the information section of the division also pointed to repugnant scenes related to women and incidents of a moral character involving the civilian population. The regional authorities of Bayreuth went as far as formally complaining about the unworthy conduct of some Spanish soldiers in local taverns. The NSDAP leaders, for their part, forbade their female members all contact with the Spaniards. The soldier Joaquin Ros, recently arrived in September 1941, summarized the atmosphere with a revealing phrase: "The Germans like us, despite the fact that our predecessors have also done some damage." Among the divisionaries themselves, news soon circulated of a camp for Polish and Russian forced female workers in neighboring Auerbach, where many went at night in search of company or sex in exchange for food and clothing. The division staff, fearful of the health hazard and the prestige of the Spanish army, ended up reinforcing the night guard to cut off those visits. Meanwhile, in Grafenwohr and during the marches, the first improvised trench bulletins began to be posted on the walls, the embryo of what would be the Hoja de Campagna, published first in Grigorovo, then in Riga, and finally in Tallinn until March 1944, with collaborations from Falangist intellectuals such as the professor of international law, Fernando Castiela, and the writer Álvaro de la Iglesia. On July 31st, 4 original regiments baptized in Madrid with the surnames of their colonels, Rodrigo, Vierna, Esparza and Pimentel, were reorganized into 3, according to the Wehrmacht model. The 4th, which was to remain in Germany as a replacement regiment, was incorporated into the other 3, while Colonel Rodrigo moved on to serve as the second in command of the division. The division was structured with the regiment's 262nd, Colonel Pedro Pimentel, 263rd, Colonel José Vierna, and 269th, Colonel José Martínez Esparza, plus an artillery regiment, engineers, anti-tank, signals, and the Mobile Reserve Battalion 250 with a total estimated strength of 18,000 men. To that group were added about 30 former White Russian combatants, most of them legionnaires or veterans of the Francoist side, integrated as translators. On August 20th, 1941, the first trains with Spanish contingents departed from Grafenwohr, 66 convoys in 5 days. The motorized columns, 200 vehicles in total, left at the end. Initial destination, Suwałki, on the border with occupied Poland. Some convoys went directly to Grodno in eastern Poland. The march toward the front had begun. What no one had explained to the Spanish volunteers during the weeks of instruction was that they would have to make a good part of the way to the front on foot. Like most German infantry divisions, the 250th was not fully motorized. Horses and feet were the motors of that machine. From Suwałki, the division undertook an interminable march along the roads of eastern Poland, Lithuania, Belarus and Russia to the city of Vitebsk, where they boarded trains again bound for the sector they had been assigned. The route on foot exceeded 800 kilometers. They did it in the middle of autumn, with the weather already having turned cold earlier than usual, with night frosts and daytime rain under the weight of equipment and with roads that for the most part were irregular tracks of earth or gravel. The consequences were immediate. 2,177 soldiers, the so-called aspiados, arrived with blisters so severe they had to be transported in vehicles to the field hospitals. The military surgeon Lopez Romero recorded in his memoirs the state in which they arrived, with torn clothes, long hair, unshaven and full of lice. 82 soldiers and non-commissioned officers were repatriated at the end of September for bad conduct or lack of physical resistance. The marching discipline was chaotic. The Guripas systematically ignored the Wehrmacht rules on uniformity and order in column. They unbuttoned their tunics. They carried their weapons any which way. They climbed onto the material transport vehicles whenever they could, overloading them even further. Some anti-tank guns arrived with names painted on them: Lola, Carmencita. On a towing vehicle hung a live chicken. The Germans who saw them pass were left speechless. Captain Hermann Schiete, from a German unit stationed in the area, described the scene in a letter to his family. The Spaniards marched on both sides of the highway at the same time, blocking traffic. The drivers of the TOT organization traveling on the road were left speechless at the spectacle that confirmed all their prejudices about the picaros from the south. Marshal von Bock himself, commander of Army Group Center to which the division was initially destined, showed evident reluctance at the prospect of having the Spaniards under his command, but morale did not flag entirely. The Falangist journalist Jesus Martinez Tessier noted in his diary on September 8, 1941, upon seeing the destroyed villages and charred Soviet tanks on the sides of the road, "On the highway from time to time you find graves of German soldiers." And 9 days later, as they drew closer to the front, wrecked tanks, some crashed red plane and German graves. The officers remained convinced that the war would be short. Everyone expected a quick German victory. The march improved in the second week of September. The division increased its pace to almost 30 kilometers a day. But when Munoz Grandes and the German liaison officer visited the headquarters of Army Group Center to finalize the details of their incorporation into the front, what they saw scandalized the hosts. The panorama was the same: units advancing on both sides of the highway, irregular clothing, unmartial scenes, so the report qualified them, and the horses in a state that demanded explanations. Then came the news. On September 25th, the OKH notified the division that its orders had changed. Army Group North needed reinforcements. Instead of the central front toward Moscow, the Spaniards would be assigned to the northern sector. There another type of war was being waged, the siege of Leningrad. The Gueripas took the news with resignation and, as recorded by the soldier Luis Aguilar, with humor, "They say that the general of the army corps to which we were assigned does not want us, because in our marches we give the impression of useless force. Perhaps it is because we go unbuttoned, with our hats to one side, and because some of our anti-tank guns have names, Lola, Carmenchita, etc., and some chicken hanging from the trailer." The columns turned, back to Vitebsk. Train to Pskov. On October 1st, 1941, Munoz Grandes and the liaison officer Gunther Kollatz arrived at the headquarters of Army Group North. 2 days later, they were at the headquarters of the 16th Army, to which the division was assigned. Logistic problems continued. The horses were exhausted, the troops were dirty and fed up with not having entered combat. The quartermaster of the liaison staff observed that the organizational deficiencies of the division had worsened during the march. On October 10, 1941, the operations diary of Army Group North recorded a less than flattering note. Doubtful that the Spanish division was capable of attacking, its appearance was unusual for German eyes. The state of the horses and vehicles was questionable. The following day, the 250th was provisionally assigned to the Army Group of General Franz von Roches, responsible for the rear zone of Army Group North. The Spaniards would not replace the German 126th Division as planned. They deployed further south, between Novgorod and the Volkhov River, north of Lake Ilmen, to relieve the German 18th Infantry Division in its defensive positions. The headquarters of the 250th Wehrmacht Division was established in Grigorovo, on the outskirts of the destroyed and almost deserted city of Novgorod. Snow was already falling, temperatures had begun to plummet, the Russian winter was beginning. The Volkhov River has in that sector an average width of 200 meters. Its banks in October 1941 were covered in mud that hardened at night until it was like cement. On the western bank, the Blue Division began to occupy its positions between October 7th and 17th. The sector spanned 40 kilometers from Novgorod in the south to Udarnik, later called Borisovo in the north. Opposite, on the eastern bank, the Soviet 267th and 305th Infantry Divisions observed. The southern third of the sector was handled by 2 battalions of the 262nd Regiment. The central third was covered by the 263rd. The northern third, the most active, corresponded to the 269th. The artillery was distributed among the 3 zones. The problems were evident from day one. 1,205 horses had been lost during the march from Poland, and only 414 had been replaced. The vehicles were in poor condition. The soldiers had not practiced firing since Grafenwar. More than 30% of the bicycles did not work. The Germans waiting in their positions watched the Spaniards arrive with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The report of the liaison officer of the 1st Army Corps was direct. The officers lacked authority, the non-commissioned officers' technical training, the soldiers tended toward indiscipline, the weapons were not properly maintained, the treatment of the horses was especially rough, kicking, etc., and the motorcycles were systematically overloaded. But, the report added, the personal bravery of all the Spaniards leaves no room for doubt. On October 23, 1941, the diary of Army Group North noted, "The courage of the Spaniards in combat is reassuring. They have repelled a Russian attack today, resulting in 300 dead and 300 enemy prisoners." In fact, by November 1941, the Spaniards had already captured at least 800 Soviet prisoners and a considerable amount of war material, inflicting serious casualties on the enemy, a fact that rarely accompanied the chronicles of their own losses. The division had been at the front barely 2 weeks when orders arrived to take the island between the Little Volkhov and the main Volkhov, coordinating their attack with the advance of the German 126th Division. The first attempt failed. On October 19th, a section of 36 men consolidated a bridgehead on the left bank of the river near Udarnik. The following day, they were joined by the 2nd Battalion of the 269th Regiment and other units. On October 27th, the Soviets reacted. Sitno was the scene of bloody combat. The Spaniards took the villages of Tigoda, Dubrovka, and Nikitkino, advancing toward the south. One of those assaults, against a fortified Soviet headquarters near Dubrovka, ended in what the military records themselves described as a senseless slaughter of dozens of soldiers. The officer who had ordered the frontal attack without sufficient support was relieved of command shortly after. It was not the only episode of that type. In the 269th Regiment, several soldiers expressed dissatisfaction with what they considered the tyrannical treatment of Colonel Esparza, who on more than one occasion had ordered attacks without adequate artillery cover, causing casualties that many judged unnecessary. The thermometers already marked negative figures that complicated everything: communications with the bridgehead, handling of weapons, care of the wounded. Then came November. With it, orders to relieve the Germans in the Otensky Monastery and the villages of Posad and Posilok. Temperatures had fallen to 20 below zero. On November 9th, a reinforced Spanish battalion relieved the Germans in Posad. The Soviets launched furious counterattacks with air and artillery support, causing heavy casualties. The connection between Otensky, Sitno, and Posad was precarious, a forest path under the snow where visibility was almost zero. The Soviet soldiers knew that type of terrain. They knew how to move among the trees. They set ambushes with ease. The Spanish soldiers, fallen in the intermediate positions and in the chapel, received, according to the express order of their commanders, instructions to remain literally nailed to the ground rather than retreat. The episode, over time, would become matter for poetic exaltation in the propaganda and literature of the division itself. But many Spaniards also knew, the legionnaires from Africa, the veterans of the Civil War who had fought in the Sierra, for them, combat in broken terrain was not new. More than one noted with pride in his diary the heroic feats that were performed. The Roman battalion in particular became a reference unit for its maneuvering capacity in that type of terrain. In early December, the Red Army intensified its counteroffensive to retake Tikhvin. Munoz Grandes informed the 38th Army Corps that in Posad only 38 men capable of fighting remained. The Germans feared the positions would fall. On the night of December 7th, without waiting for German orders, the Spaniards abandoned Posad due to the risk of being surrounded by fresh Siberian troops. The following day, they evacuated Sitno, Dubrovka, and other positions on the east bank. They left behind light cannons, equipment, weapons. They had not properly mined the abandoned positions nor destroyed the artillery they could not transport. The Germans noted it. On December 9th, the last Spaniards crossed the Volkhov to the western bank. On December 7th, furthermore, Tikhvin returned to Soviet hands, which allowed Leningrad to receive supplies again through Lake Ladoga. The front on that stretch of the Volkhov and the Ilmen would remain stabilized until the Great Soviet Offensive of January 1944, while further South Army Group Center had also failed in its attempt to take Moscow. Pravda published reports about the bleeding of the fascist Blue Division. In tactical terms, the retreat was a fact. In human terms, the figures vary notably according to the source. A medical report from January 18, 1942 listed 793 dead, 1,883 wounded, 899 frozen and 1,365 sick, 4% of the total of the division, while the calculations, often unreliable, of Army Group North had spoken at the end of 1941 of barely 500 Spanish fallen. A later report, 1 month later, raised the figure to 1,032 dead, 800 seriously wounded, 1,400 slightly wounded, 160 missing and 300 frozen to death. By July 25, 1942, the accumulated count reached 1,247 dead, including 61 officers, 3,263 wounded, 123 of them officers, and 127 missing, among them 3 officers. To put those figures in perspective, the German 126th Division, deployed in the same sector, suffered 3,405 casualties between October and December of that same year, a level of attrition comparable to the Spanish. More than a quarter of the strength of the Blue Division in less than 3 months, according to any of those counts, but the front had stabilized, and there, in the positions on the western bank of the Volkhov, the Spaniards would stay for many more months. What no one knew then is that the Soviet reports, based on interrogations of prisoners and captured war diaries, described the Blue Division as a body of highly motivated volunteers, full of fanatical fascists. The Red Army respected its adversaries enough to describe them with care. And in the hardest winter of the century, with 40 degrees below zero on the plains south of Lake Ladoga, there was something that the Soviet intelligence reports had not fully calibrated: the endurance of those men under circumstances that no training manual had described. The lowest thermometer reading that any divisionary recorded in his diary during the Christmas weeks of 1941 marked 53 degrees below zero. It was noted by Alberto Coscola, one of the participants in a rescue mission to Lake Ilmen on January 10, 1942. Never in the course of this war, he wrote, would men march and fight under such cold. The cold of the Volkhov was qualitatively different from what any southern European had experienced. It was not the cold of the Spanish mountains in December. It was a cold that got into the metal of the weapons and rendered them useless. That turned mud into stone and stone into a trap. That caused eyelids to stick together upon waking if one had slept with their face uncovered. That killed. Frostbite multiplied. Feet, fingers, ears, nose, everything left exposed for more than a few minutes could be lost. An entire company received 32 Iron Crosses for having maintained their positions for days with temperatures that had incapacitated almost all their men. Almost 20 soldiers suffered the amputation of both legs in that same action. The iron for the cross was cold, too. Winter equipment arrived late and insufficiently. The entire Wehrmacht had miscalculated. No one in the OKW had foreseen that the campaign would extend beyond the autumn of 1941. The Spanish soldiers received some additional warm items, but the boots that chronic problem remained inadequate for those temperatures for weeks. The local solution was pragmatic and inelegant, wrapping feet in pieces of blanket, putting straw inside footwear, stealing the Valenki, the Russian felt boots from Soviet prisoners. In the trenches, daily life was a constant negotiation with the environment. The shelters logs, packed earth, straw offered some protection against the extreme cold, but not against boredom and fear. The script of the hours was always the same. Guard, relief, eat whatever was there, sleep in short shifts, return to guard. The diary of non-commissioned officer Benjamin Arenales, a Castilian from Burgos, an old-school phalangist who had left his post as a military lawyer in Cuenca to enlist records that monotony with a detail that gives vertigo. I write with gloves. The pen freezes if I let it go for more than 30 seconds. On Monday and Wednesday there was mail. The days when correspondence arrived from Spain, the mood in the trenches rose perceptibly. Those who did not receive letters tried to hide it. German military censorship read all shipments, and analysts of the Allied Information Service did too. From those letters, Soviet intelligence built psychological profiles of the Spanish units. The divisionaries wrote with a frankness that would have horrified any security officer. They spoke of their fears, of their doubts, of the incomprehensible harshness of that winter, but also of other things. Christmas Eve. 1941 was a strange moment in the Volkhov trenches. The soldiers had obtained some items to prepare a dinner. Spanish wine in some cases. Turon arrived in packages from family. And then, just as some groups began to sing, the Soviet positions attacked. German intelligence reports described the scene without irony. The Spaniards, interrupted in the middle of Christmas dinner, responded with a reaction capacity that surprised the attackers. There was a factor that German analysts had noted but did not know how to classify: the tendency of the guerrillas to treat combat as something almost personal. Not as a military function, but as a dispute between specific individuals. The German sub-lieutenant who communicated with them through a Polish interpreter described in a report how a group of Spanish soldiers, after recovering a lost position on Christmas night, returned to their trenches singing. Not Cara al Sol, the phalangist anthem, but the song of the legionnaire, as if they had just won a fight in a tavern and were walking back home. And that, strangely, was part of why they worked. At the end of 1941, the headquarters of the German 18th Army had accumulated enough reports on the Blue Division to form an opinion. Marshal Georg von Kuchler informed the OKW that the combative bravery of the Spaniards diminished slowly but surely, and asked for the division to be replaced by a German one. General Friedrich Wilhelm von Chapuis, commander of the 38th Army Corps, predicted in mid-November that the 250th Division would not last long, and even proposed diverting a third of the German 61st Division to relieve the Spaniards and return them to the western bank of the Volkhov, to a relatively quiet sector. General Busch opined that the Spaniards were only useful defensively in quiet sectors, and attributed the failure to wear down Soviet troops to the lack of Spanish mobility, their high losses, and the effects of the cold. The Germans had reasons for their criticisms. The division was a constant logistical problem. Its officers, too many in proportion to the non-commissioned officers, lacked the tactical training necessary for modern war on the Eastern Front. Its soldiers were undisciplined by Wehrmacht standards. And yet, Hitler did not authorize the relief. The reasons were diplomatic: replacing the Spaniards with German troops and concentrating the Iberians as a sort of Spanish enclave around Novgorod implied, according to Army Group North, foreign policy issues that did not depend entirely on the army. The head of the 16th Army himself elevated the request to the Führer, who rejected it. And curiously, Hitler himself had a personal assessment of his allies that nuanced the contempt of his generals. He considered them undisciplined but reliable comrades. Obersahlmeister Ludwig Schwab, stationed in the garrison of Hof, left in 1944 a revealing portrait of how the Germans saw the racial composition of the Spanish troop. He described the soldiers as a conglomerate ranging from tall, blonde and blue-eyed Aryans, descendants of the Goths, to mestizos of African descent, small, dark, with curly hair and negroid features, who, despite their racial impurity in Nazi eyes, were seen as proud and extremely nationalist. So the Blue Division stayed, and in that forced permanence, something was changing. The experience of combat did what the Grafenwohr training had not achieved. It created a culture of unity. The units that had survived the Volkov winter were beginning to function in a way that the manuals did not describe exactly, but that veterans recognized immediately. The Volkov soldier was not the same one who had arrived from Grafenwohr. On the Soviet side, the analysis was different. NKVD reports based on interrogations of Spanish prisoners and captured documents described the division as a highly motivated unit, composed mainly of fanatical anti-communists. This was not exactly true. The division was much more heterogeneous than that, but the error was understandable. The Spaniards who fell prisoner tended to be the most combative, those who had held out longest in impossible positions. Those who surrendered more easily generally did not end up captured. They fled toward the rear, were evacuated for wounds, or simply disappeared. The real number of deserters who crossed over to the Red Army was low. For the entire campaign, estimates speak of between 80 and 100 men, an average of barely 2 for every 1,000, a figure at least 8 times lower than the desertion rate recorded among the combatants of the international brigades during the Spanish Civil War, which ranged between 1.7 and 1.9%. To monitor that risk, the information section, IIB, of the division went as far as compiling between 1941 and 1943 a file of undesirables that ended up totaling 2,271 names, and in the first 6 months of the replacement system, barely 2% of the soldiers were repatriated due to political backgrounds that caused fear of desertion or espionage. Cases of self-mutilation, shooting oneself in the hand, standing guard barefoot to cause frostbite were equally scarce. In its 2 years of deployment, 21 soldiers were tried and sentenced to death for serious crimes such as desertion or treason. 14 of them were executed, along with 2 others already in the Blue Legion, and between November 1941 and August 1942, 24 courts-martial were held for desertion. Some individual cases illustrate that fate. The day laborer Martin Ferrero, a communist during the Civil War, had enlisted in 1942 with the hope of crossing to the enemy. Instead, he was treated as a prisoner by the Soviets themselves. Alberto Moreno, an ex-anarchist militiaman, crossed Soviet lines and ended up equally in a prisoner camp. Sotero Garcia, without a political background but with a criminal past in the black market of Manresa, enlisted under a false name with the intention of deserting. His attempt cost him 10 years of captivity in Soviet camps. The figures circulating in Allied propaganda were, in any case, much higher than reality. In August 1941, British Ambassador Samuel Hoare reported, after a conversation with the Anglophile General Antonio Aranda, that 750 volunteers had already gone over to the enemy. Reality, according to Soviet records themselves, was much more modest. Until February 1942, there had only been 6 confirmed deserters and 1 doubtful case who declared having enlisted with the explicit intention of switching sides. According to Soviet sources, the total may have reached 12. Among German soldiers of rank, the perception of the Spaniards was more nuanced than that of their generals. The Lanzer, that is what German privates called each other, valued in their allies what their commanders criticized: individual bravery, self-assurance, the readiness for hand-to-hand combat. But that camaraderie had limits and cracks. A Soviet report based on prisoner statements, dated September 1941, even before the division reached the front, recorded that in Novgorod, clashes between Spaniards and Germans arose again. Skirmishes between Axis soldiers in the villages of the Leningrad front rear were frequent, almost always related to competition for food and fuel supplies in a systematically looted territory. Some of those frictions ended in tragedy. In November 1943, 6 Spanish soldiers starred in several scandals in the taverns of Königsberg, and when they were reprimanded by German combatants, they opened fire against their own brothers in arms, leaving 1 divisionary dead and several wounded. In January 1943, a group of Spanish soldiers unleashed a wave of violence against German soldiers to avenge the mistreatment inflicted by a Lancer on a Russian woman. The most common motive for dispute between Iberians and Germans, in fact, was none other than competition for Baltic, Russian, or German women in the rear. The Iron Crosses were not distributed automatically. Between November 11, 1941 and March 31, 1942, the Spaniards received 159 Iron Crosses second class, compared to 161 awarded to German soldiers of the same 38th Army Corps. 325 more Spaniards received the War Merit Cross second class, compared to 210 German ones. Some Wehrmacht officers explained this treatment as a political deference toward their allies. Others, with more frankness, recognized that the figures were proportional to the combat. And in the barracks at the front, when the Guripas and the Lanza coincided in adjacent positions, cultural misunderstandings were an inexhaustible source of anecdotes. The Germans found the Spaniards too noisy, too dirty, too much of everything. The Spaniards found the Germans too cold, too rigid, too Prussian, but when combat arrived, differences blurred. A German report from April 1942 circulated the absurd rumor that Spanish soldiers had appeared in Warsaw, a city they had never visited, with almost no equipment or weapons because they had sold everything. It was a legend. But it reflected the image the Lanza had of their allies, unpredictable, unable to follow the manual, and yet somehow always present where they should be when it mattered. In August 1942, the Blue Division was transferred to the Leningrad front. It left the Volkhov, the swamps, the forests, the 40 degrees below zero to occupy positions in the southern suburbs of the besieged city. The new sector was different, more urbanized, with higher troop density on both sides, with the city itself visible from some advanced positions. Leningrad had been under siege for almost a year. The city had resisted thanks to a supply route crossing Lake Ladoga, first in barges during the autumn, then over ice during the winter, the so-called Road of Life, but conditions for its inhabitants were extremely harsh. In the most intense months of the blockade, more than 5,000 people died daily of hunger, cold, and exhaustion. The most conservative calculations place civilian deaths at 800,000 during the entire siege. Other estimates reach 1,300,000. The city that Leningrad was in January 1944, when Russian artillery finally liberated it, had 630,000 people, less than half than before the war. In that context, the Blue Division covered a 34-kilometer sector south of the perimeter. Its positions on the Leningrad-Moscow highway were strategically important. Whoever controlled that line controlled the flow of supplies and reinforcements toward the southern front of the siege. The Soviets knew it. That is why they chose that sector for their great offensive of February 1943. Life in the trenches of the Leningrad sector had its own peculiarities. The more static front of positions than that of the Volkhov generated a different type of war. Night skirmishes, raids, sniper duels, constant exchange of artillery fire. The Guripas had learned in the previous year to adapt. They knew by now how to behave with the Russian civilians in the area's villages, a complex relationship we will speak of, how to negotiate with the Germans, how to survive the winter. General Emilio Esteban Infantes had taken command of the division in December 1942, relieving Munoz Grandes, who was recalled to Madrid with honors. Esteban Infantes was a different man, more methodical, less charismatic, more concerned with the operative aspects of combat and less with the symbolic ones, the type of general who preferred to speak of ammunition and firing angles rather than crusades. In the coming battle, that attitude was going to be useful. Since November 1942, German intelligence had detected movements of Soviet troops south of the Leningrad front, large concentrations of infantry, artillery, and armored vehicles. The Red Army was preparing something of magnitude. What no one in the German sector, neither the generals nor the intelligence officers, managed to fully calculate was the exact scale of what was being prepared. The Soviet General Staff had a name for that operation, Operation Polar Star, and the focal point of its western arm was the sector defended by the Spaniards. On February 10th, 1943, at 6:45 in the morning, the sky fell. That is the description most repeated in the testimonies of the survivors. More than 800 heavy-caliber cannons, other sources raised the figure to 1,000, opened fire from the Soviet positions in Kolpino simultaneously. For almost 2 hours, 36,000 projectiles fell upon the Spanish positions. The Stalin organs, so the Wehrmacht soldiers called the BM-13 Katyusha multiple rocket launchers for the whistling sound they made when firing, added their roar to the chorus. The landscape of trenches and shelters that the Guripas had built for months became a field of smoking craters. The Blue Division deployed in that sector a reinforced regiment and 3 infantry battalions. The Mobile Reserve Battalion 250, nicknamed La Tia Bernarda, the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 262nd Regiment, the Mortar Battalion, and the Engineers. Among all sources, the numbers range between 4,200 and 5,600 soldiers. Facing them, the Soviet 55th Army of General Vladimir Sviridov had 4 complete divisions, the 45th and 63rd Guard Rifle Divisions, the 43rd Rifle Division, and the 34th Ski Brigade, plus armour from the 33rd Tank Regiment, with a total that diverse sources place between 38,000 and 45,000 men, 10 to 1, or more. The first Spanish defensive line gave way by mid-morning. The Soviet tanks, repulsed in the first attempt, returned. The armoured vehicles circulated through the streets of the small town of Krasny Bor, while the defenders tried to face them from improvised positions. The Spanish soldiers surviving the bombardment emerged from the shelters, placed machine guns in the funnels of the craters, put anti-tank guns in position. It was a numantine defence. They used the comparison themselves. One of the most remembered episodes of that day was that of the Engineer Corporal Antonio Ponteanido. The Soviet tanks were approaching the building that served as a hospital and powder magazine at the same time. Ponte took a magnetic mine and ran toward the nearest armoured vehicle to attach it to the hull. The paint on the battle tank was slippery, the mine detached. Ponte died trying. He would receive the Laureate Cross of San Fernando posthumously, the highest decoration of the Spanish army. It was one of 3 laureates granted on that day alone. In the sector known as the Crest, 40 soldiers held out in a bunker while the armoured vehicles passed by their flanks. Some defenders performed actions that in later reports the commanders described with the word suicidal, without that term having any negative connotation in that context. They were men who had decided they would not move. 9 hours of fierce combat through the streets and outskirts of Krasny Bor. Toward the end of the afternoon, when the Spaniards were about to retreat toward the forests surrounding the town, something appeared that no one had asked for, and that changed the course of the day. A squadron of Luftwaffe Stuka bombers that dropped their loads on the advanced Soviet columns. It was not enough to recover what was lost, but it was enough so that the impulse of the Soviet attack stopped before becoming a definitive rupture of the front. During the night of February 10th to 11th, the Soviets continued to press. The Spaniards had retreated toward the rear edge of their resistance zone. The so-called Third Improvised Defensive Line was what remained between the Red Army and the possibility of surrounding the German 18th Army. General Esteban Infantes ordered the necessary retreats and concentrations to maintain that line. He did not count on significant reserves. What he had was what there was. The front stabilized. Operation Polar Star had failed in its objective to break the siege in that sector. The Soviets had advanced 3 kilometers. The siege of Leningrad continued. The final liberation of the city did not arrive until January 27, 1944. The price paid by the Spaniards in Krasny Bor was devastating. On February 15th, the Blue Division reported 3,645 casualties between dead and wounded, plus 300 missing or prisoners. That represented between 70 and 75% of the troops that had participated in the battle. The Rifle Battalion had lost nearly 90% of its initial strength. In a single day, Wednesday, February 10th, statistics counted 1,125 dead, 91 missing, and 1,036 wounded. The Red Army lost on that day and the following around 9,000 to 10,000 men. Radio Moscow and the BBC presented Krasny Bor to the world as a Soviet victory. In Madrid, the government asked for constant reports from Berlin about what happened. In Berlin itself, the episode was noted. Hitler had called the Guripas a gang of ragamuffins on more than one occasion. But in the context of Stalingrad, the defeat that in that same month of February sank the German mood Krasny Bor had a different meaning. The ragamuffins had held out. There is a dimension of the Blue Division experience that memorials and glorifications tended to omit, and that the historian Zosem Nunes Seixas documented in detail in his work based on diaries, letters, and military archives from various countries. The relationship between Spanish soldiers and the Russian civilian population under occupation. Army Group North occupied large territories of the Novgorod region and the southern area of Lake Ladoga. In those villages lived Russian peasants, mostly elderly, women and children, given that young men had been mobilized or deported who suddenly found themselves under the authority of a foreign army. The Wehrmacht had given general instructions on the treatment of the civilian population. In practice, what happened depended much on the specific unit and the individuals. The Spaniards arrived in that area with a specific cultural baggage. For many, the Russian was an abstraction loaded with years of anti-Bolshevik propaganda, the Asian, the Mongol, the barbarian. But upon arriving and finding the actual peasants, poor people, hard-working with a silent dignity that misery had not erased, the image was significantly modified. The testimonies are contradictory but revealing. On one hand, there was systematic looting. The Russian interpreter Vladimir Kovalevsky described how the Spaniards looted Polish and Russian peasants during the march, and how those actions ceased temporarily when the command executed some looter as a warning. Another soldier wrote bluntly that the Guripas did not behave like angels either. Shouting, "Spanish alles Catholic," they took everything there was in the houses. When someone responded, "Deutschland nicht katholisch, kaputt," accompanying the gesture of a cut to the neck, the peasants gave what they had. But there was another side. Unlike most German soldiers of Army Group North, who followed OKW instructions to maintain distance from civilians, the Guripas tended to relate to Russian civilians directly, sometimes warmly, frequently chaotically. They shared food when they had surplus. They accompanied them to their own masses. They played with the children. Some learned words in Russian, enough to negotiate food or to make jokes. Several post-war Russian testimonies described the Spaniards as more human occupiers than the Germans, although that description must be read with caution. It came from survivors who had experienced both types of occupation, and the parameters of comparison were low in both cases. There were also romantic relationships. German intelligence reports mention with increasing discomfort the frequency with which Spanish soldiers maintained unauthorized contacts with Russian, Baltic women, and even with forced workers deported from Western Europe. One divisionary went so far as to travel from the front to Zwickau in Saxony to visit a Russian ex-girlfriend who had been deported as a forced worker to Germany. The trip ended in his arrest and repatriation. Another killed a guard at a spinning mill in Hof, who caught him trying to enter at night to see a French worker. The German command observed these situations with a mixture of irritation and resignation. Instructions on correct conduct in Germany and at the front were reiterated. The results were irregular. In Hof, the Bavarian city where replacement convoys concentrated before departing east, approximately 60 illegitimate births were recorded during the years of the division attributed to Spanish soldiers. Many of those children were adopted by German families. On the Jewish question, the most serious in historical terms, the documents are specific and must be read with precision. The Blue Division operated in the same zone where the Einsatzgruppen and SS units carried out mass executions of Jews in the area's cities. Several divisionaries passed through Grodno, Ośmiany, Vilna and Riga during their rest or convalescence periods. Some left records of what they saw: ghettos, columns of civilians marching under armed custody, the unmistakable smell of what was happening in the forests on the outskirts. The testimonies of the divisionaries regarding those scenes varied. Some expressed revulsion. Dionisio Ridruejo, who would become one of the first critics of Francoism within Spain itself, recorded his horror at what he witnessed and eventually turned it into an argument against the regime he had served. Others watched without fully understanding or without wanting to understand. Some made gestures of individual protection. There are documented cases of Guripas who warned Jews of imminent operations, but none intervened systematically. The division as a whole did not participate directly in the deportations or mass executions in the territory where it operated, but its members were witnesses to what was happening around them, and the most uncomfortable part of that record is that, to a large extent, they chose not to write much about it. In October 1943, Franco took the decision he had been postponing for months to withdraw the Blue Division. Allied pressure was intense. The memorandum presented to the German foreign minister on October 1st of that year explained it with frankness. The growing difficulties in recruiting real volunteers were leading to the use of coercive methods, which could no longer be kept secret indefinitely. And that would place Spain in an even more difficult position before the Allies. There was another reason, not written in the memorandum but present in all calculations. After Stalingrad, the war was lost for Germany. Franco knew it. His ministers knew it. Even the most Germanophiles in the government were beginning to do their accounts. The division was dissolved in November 1943. In its place remained the Blue Legion, a formation of much smaller size, a few companies of volunteers attached to the German 121st Infantry Division. The Legion was at the front until March 14, 1944, when it was also repatriated. But even after that date, several hundred Spaniards stayed in Germany of their own will, some joining units of the Waffen-SS, others working in auxiliary services. Some of them fought in the last combats in Berlin in April and May 1945. They were by then a handful. The city was burning. Between 1941 and 1945, nearly 500 to 600 divisionaries fell prisoner to the Red Army. They remained in Soviet camps until 1954. In March of that year, the International Red Cross chartered the ship Semiramis to repatriate 248 of them. They arrived at the port of Barcelona with the same type of ambiguous reception that would define the memory of the Blue Division for decades. Heroes for some, uncomfortable evidence for others. The total casualties of the division in its entire existence are as follows, according to the most complete records: 3,934 dead in combat, 570 deaths by disease, 326 missing or captured, 8,466 wounded, 7,800 sick, and 1,600 frozen. Total, 22,700 casualties. The Red Army, in combats directly attributable to the division, suffered an estimated 49,300 casualties. In terms of decorations, the division brought back from Russia more than 2,600 Iron Crosses, two of them knights awarded to Generals Munoz Grandes and Esteban Infantes. 8 members received the Laureate of San Fernando, the highest Spanish military decoration, 7 of them posthumously. What came after was a long and tortuous negotiation with memory. On October 12, 2004, in the military parade for the Day of Hispanicity in Madrid, the Socialist Defense Minister José Bono took a decision that generated controversy for weeks. He invited to the presidential dais a representative of the Blue Division, a veteran who had been a prisoner of the Soviets, and placed him next to a representative of the Spanish 9th Company La Nueve of General Leclerc's 2nd Armoured Division, which had fought with the Allies in the liberation of Paris. The two men, from sides that had been on opposite ends of the Second World War, shared a platform under the same Spanish flag. The image was uncomfortable for almost everyone present. For some, it was an unacceptable rehabilitation of Hitler's combatants. For others, an unfair equating of those who had fought with the Allies and those who had marched with the Nazis. For the veterans of the Blue Division and their families, it was a late recognition of a sacrifice that, in their reading, had been anti-communist rather than Nazi. What that scene revealed is that, more than 60 years later, the Blue Division remained in Spain an unfinished matter. The Franco regime had treated the veterans of the division with a characteristic ambivalence. On one hand, their heroic deeds filled books, reports, and ceremonies. Streets were inaugurated with the name Blue Division in several cities, the one in Vitoria, for example, in 1961. The veterans had their associations, their magazines, their annual meetings. On the other hand, Franco himself minimized the significance of the division more and more as the Cold War progressed and Spain needed to integrate into the Western Bloc. The official narrative was rewritten. The division had been an anti-communist and Catholic crusade, without any connection to the extermination projects of Nazism. The geographical proximity to the Holocaust, the Guripas who had passed through the Vilna ghettos, who had smelled the smoke from the forests on the outskirts of Riga, was buried under layers of euphemism and silence. Post-Franco Spanish democracy also did not find a clear way to address that heritage. Successive governments chose to ignore it rather than confront it. In the military archives, in the documentary funds, in the notes that the Guripas left in letters and diaries, there was enough material for a more complex history than the one told in veteran meetings or in military academy manuals. But that history required comfort with ambiguity, and ambiguity has always been politically uncomfortable. In October 2020, a Spanish police operation against supposed Russian contacts with Catalan independence leaders carried the codename Operation Volkhov. The name the First Front, where the Spaniards of the division fought, echoed in the intelligence offices more than 75 years later. It was a sign, perhaps involuntary, that history remained present in Spanish institutional memory in ways that no one had fully catalogued. In Germany, the Spanish military cemetery of Pankovka, near Novgorod, houses the remains of several hundred divisionaries. The crosses are white. Some have names, others only a number. The cold of the Russian winter did not distinguish, when acting on the bodies, between convinced phalangists, day labourers from Huelva who needed the 7 pesetas a day, university students from the SEU who sought a generational feat, or ex-republicans who had gone to seek an escape route and had found it in the worst possible way. 47,000 men passed through the Blue Division between 1941 and 1943. Almost 5,000 died in combat. The rest returned to a Spain that was at once the same they had left and completely different. They carried scars they did not fully know how to tell. A war that Europe preferred they had not fought, and the memory of a winter that none forgot.